So this is what I call the technologizing of youth, this kind of homogenizing representation of the entire generation of youth as being either necessarily and naturally wired to technology or sort of enslaved to it. This whole generation sort of described uniformly just by the technologies they use. But there's then this particular thing about the packaging up, the commoditizing of their ways of writing, their ways of speaking, and sort of selling it. I'm going to show you just one. Maybe I'll see if I've got time to show you two. These are two advertisements, commercials from America, very popular, very well known, from Singular, which just exemplify this sort of the packaging up of what kids. Sometimes I show these things to my students, and they're like, "What the hell?" And, you know, who knew this was going to be such a sort of fetish for grown-ups?
OMG, IMBD.
It is a big deal. Who are you texting 50 times a day?
IDK, my BFF Jill.
Tell your BFF Jill that I'm taking away your phone.
TISNF. Me paying this bill, that's what says DNF.
Now, too much texting is NBD. Singular brings you unlimited texting, just $5 more a month. And get an LG broadband phone free. The new AT&T. Your world.
Talk about recontextualizing. I've just sold Singular to you, haven't I? Yeah. There's another one here.
Beth Ann, 3,000 texts last month.
NWRUS.
That wasn't a compliment. Sean, 1,000 texts?
UGH.
And you're old enough to know better.
MYOB, will you?
Grandma.
Mom, who could you be texting?
IDK, my BFF Rose.
Now get a texting plan the whole family can NJOY. AT&T brings your family.
Yes, oh, yeah, yeah. So you get the idea, this sort of fetishizing, sort of very exaggerated reproduction or representation of what actually gets done. It's problematic in all sorts of ways, particularly I think in the way that adults are using it to shore up their own identities as grown-ups, this sort of exoticizing of kids' practice. I'll come back to that in a moment. But these are just some frameworks that I want to then look at some actual text messaging and instant messaging. So we all know, thanks to Christine in particular, for the talk that we started off with, about the industrial educational matrix, complex. This is the other kind of very hand-in-glove order of discourse that produces a lot of this meta-discourse, this rhetoric around young people's media language. And that's the disciplining of their play that happens thanks to language workers like journalists, people who are kind of heavily invested in language and policing language. Linguists would be another group. And then, of course, teachers, educationalists. So I don't want to really rehearse some of this because Christine did it very, very nicely. But what interests me here is this, what Fairclough calls this technologizing of discourse, the way that it gets taken up by the media, but also in other quarters as just as a language as a tool, communication as a skill. There's another sort of way in which kids are technologized. And if you look at this from the National Institute for Literacy, what interests me is not just the sort of the skilling and the tooling of human communicative processes, but the way that new literacies are eclipsed, again, by the old literacies, the traditional literacies. There's very little space given for the stuff that the kids actually do much more readily, which is all perfectly literate, of course. Last point, before looking at some actual practice, just to up the ante a little bit in terms of my critique. I think part of where this is coming from is this decentering of power. And I'm going to come back to this in just a second, but I want to just sort of talk about what's actually happening in terms of creative practice. But this way that adults and other sort of parents, who are understandably quite alarmed by some of this, are reacting. And I think some of the way that this incredibly negative oppositional framing of new media creativity emerges is out of a sense of power being lost. We don't know what the hell is going on. We don't know this technology. So that's my sort of more critical moment. And I think the way that a lot of what I see being written about is actually it's all about adults. It's about adults shoring up their own identity as adults, sort of exhausting. We love to talk about, oh God, the kids these days, this generation. And a lot of the mock text messages, these absolutely non-realistic, improbable, there's any number of stylistic reasons why this is not a real text message, not least of which, what self-respecting young British teenager is going to be writing, God save our gracious Queen, God save our noble Queen? In what context would that be done? It's ridiculous. It's fabricated. It's lying, basically. It's not real. But this kind of mock text speak, to borrow Jane Hill's idea of mock Spanish, is about elevating adulthood, not really doing any kind of authentic or legitimate representation in actual practice. Okay, so that's just a little bit of framing. Let me actually move then on to looking at some actual play, the playing of language. And I don't need to spend too much time. I mean, you know, a lot of you know the kind of thing I'm going to show you. So here's some of the ways that I think, and I just want to talk a little bit about creativity in new media language. The most common way that it gets talked about by the press, but also by us, by scholars in the sort of growing literature on new media language, is to sort of focus on orthographic or typographic innovation. And there's three reasons why this typically sort of it happens for young people. It's to do with maximizing sort of brevity and speeding things up to abbreviate. But also much more creativity, I think, in some ways, for this sort of prosodic marking and speech simulation. And I've given you a couple of examples from Graham Jones and Bambi Schifflin's really nice paper, which is actually about the quotative life, but they've just got some really lovely instant messaging data, which are the extracts that I've thrown there. And I think there's just, for me, undeniably something very, very clever, very artful to think about Michael Tooman's talk. Just very, very clever, very reflexive about what young people are doing. I'm a little concerned, though, the way that we are ourselves kind of obsessing with linguistic form and spelling. And I think there are much more interesting ways that creative practice emerges. And you might actually call that discursive innovation rather than sort of orthographic or typographic. It's lovely and it's very important. But there's all sorts of other things that young people are doing. Reworking material and design constraints. I'll come back to that. Sort of capitalizing on what would appear to be technological limitations or the limiting affordances of technology. And when I say technology, I'm thinking linguistic technologies like grammar, and also material, digital technologies like space, bandwidth, and so on. Lots of people talk about the hybridizing of speech and writing. This is really fascinating, the way this is working. Very creative, very playful. Multimodal reality. This design consciousness, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment, this visual awareness that's played with. Translocal multilingualism, a colleague in Jyväskylä, Sari Lepainen and her colleagues, looking at the way the Finnish kids, amongst others, are playing with different languages, recontextualizing text messaging style from around the world and so on, and other languages. What I want to do, though, is I want to really take us to this, to what's often just going on, and the context under which any of this linguistic creativity is happening. And that's just around the maximizing of sociality and play. And I asked my students in my discourse class to record some of their instant messaging exchanges. And I just literally, out of a pile of 100, pulled the first one I came to, and this was it, which just very conveniently has the phrase "just playing" in the middle of it. And it's the one on your handout. And I don't want to dwell on it because I don't have time, but what I want to do is just draw your attention to all of the green stuff is all of the common typographic play that's going on. But actually it's the ha-has and the he-he's and the footing of all of this. The framing of this is something really playful and enjoyable. And this is really very typical. It's banal, it's lovely, and it's not, I don't mean to undermine it with the notion of banal, but it's just a very everyday, playful, kairotic, in the moment. It's spontaneous. There's a tremendous reflexivity, but not a sort of strategicness about this. That actually people are moving too fast for that to be happening. This is 4 minutes of exchange. So it's the playfulness that I want to work forward from now. What's also interesting is actually new media discourse, the linguistic practices and creativity, far more creative than standard English, and also far more variable. There is no text messaging style. There's as much variation from person to person as anything. I mean, it becomes very difficult to definitively say what constitutes text messaging style. There are kids who would not be seen dead using an emoticon. There are kids who would never abbreviate a text message. I mean, it's so variable, much more so than the orthographies of standard English.